Welcome to Unlocking High Performance, a podcast for leaders who believe great results should never come at the expense of their people. I'm Jason Lauritsen, an advisor to CEOs and leadership teams who want to accelerate performance without burning people out. Now, today we're going to break down what actually drives employee performance at work. This is prompted by a conversation I had very recently with a CEO who was kind of talking through, a situation that he was wrestling with. He had a group within his organization where performance was kind of getting stuck. The directives from leadership were sort of getting stuck at the kind of middle management layer. And so the results of what they were sort of needing from them or asking them to do just weren't happening. Or at least it was a lot harder to get them to do the things that they were needing than he thought it should be. And he was kind of asking this question, why, or struggling with the question, why can't we get them to make this happen? And so we were chatting through that, and he was like most of the leaders that I work with at first when they encounter a situation like this. He was assuming he had a motivation problem. That, this group of managers just weren't properly motivated to do the thing that they needed them to do, to go sort of make this happen. And he, like most of the leaders I work with at first, was misdiagnosing what's actually going on, because it is almost never a motivation issue. And so today what we're going to do is break down what actually drives employee performance at work and what goes wrong most commonly when employee performance gets stuck or starts to break down. And when I say employee, that's at all levels of the organization, from the front line to the leaders at the top. And what I'm going to share with you today is sort of what I affectionately call the 5 drivers of performance. And it's what I've distilled through a couple of decades of coaching leaders and managers through the most kind of common issue and challenge that they face, which is dealing with an employee or a member of their team who is underperforming or is maybe not, maybe their performance issue is actually a behavioral issue. They're not showing up or behaving or interacting in the team in the way that they should be, and it's causing issues with their performance. Here's what I've learned over the course of those couple of decades is that while we tend to want to make, performance feel more complicated, because we're dealing with people and all of these issues kind of show up and look a little bit different, the reality is what I have discovered is that there's really only 5 sort of causes of underperformance or performance breakdown. They show up in a lot of different ways. They have, slightly different sort of toppings on them sometimes, if you will. But when you really get to the essence of them, they boil down to 5 things. And the most common cause of underperformance, the one that is the case, I would say, in probably 4 out of 5 cases, is that the individual does not know what's expected of them. That this individual is not clear about what's being asked or what's being expected. And this is one of the things that we tend to assume that we are far more clear than we are. And when we actually get clear about what's expected, my experience has shown me that most people want to do a good job. Most people want to be successful in their role. Most people, they want to show up and get the job done because that tends to mean they get more opportunity, or they might get promoted, or they might get a bigger raise. So most people are pretty motivated to do the thing that they are being asked to do, so long as they understand what it is. The challenge is when people are unclear, often they don't know that they're unclear, or they don't know how to get more clear or what to do. And so if you aren't setting clear expectations for them, that is pretty disruptive. And so this can be clarity about goals. sort of what actually matters. What exactly is it that we're asking you to do? What does success look like there? It can be clarity about, behavioral expectations, how we are expected to show up in our role, how we are expected to treat each other. And generally, where these expectations break down, or why this is such a big issue, is that even though we will sit down, and perhaps we've even sat down and talked with the individual and we thought we explained it pretty clearly, we often skip over a really important step, which is to write things down or put them in writing so that people can really make sure that they understand or are clear about it. And so this is a really big one. Like I said, in my experience, and this isn't a broad sample, this is only my experience, but I would estimate that when I've seen performance issues, performance breakdown where things just aren't working for whatever reason, that almost 80% of the time, if not slightly more, it's because the individual is not clear on what's expected. They don't know what's expected. So that's cause number one. It's basically a lack of clarity about what's expected. The second biggest cause of underperformance is that the individual they might be clear on what's expected, but they don't realize that they are not meeting that expectation. And this is, of course, a failure of feedback, right? They're not getting any feedback about how they're doing, or maybe they don't have visibility into any measurement or feedback about how they're performing. And that, I know that sometimes we can think we're giving feedback to individuals on our teams, and actually, you think, how could they possibly not know? But I think from my own experience, the best example I can give of this is a long time ago, in one of my very first jobs inside of a corporate organization. I came in, I was a member of an HR team. My previous life had been in sales and recruiting. And so I'd been kind of a solo performer, kind of on my own, Lone Ranger, if you will. And so coming in to work as part of a team in a corporation, I didn't really understand how that worked very well. So I was learning as I went. And one of the things that I didn't realize was how important sort of peer relationships were. I was just doing my job, and I was working with my team. I was, building relationships with my internal customers, but I really wasn't spending much time. I didn't pay much attention to my peers, my fellow HR managers on the HR team, because it didn't seem relevant to me, to getting my job done or being successful. And so at the end of the year, I had my performance appraisal with my boss, and all the metrics that, like sort of the goals that measured the outcomes of my team and my performance were all really good. But I got dinged on, or she dinged me on my performance appraisal because she was getting complaints from my peers that I wasn't, interacting with them, being a team player, building relationships with them. And that was fair criticism because I legitimately didn't know that was important. And so here I am. I wasn't clear about that expectation. I think my boss probably assumed that I knew that this was important, but I didn't, because the context of the work I'd done before, it didn't really matter if I was friends with the other recruiters in the place I worked or the other salespeople, because our individual performance wasn't measured based on or impacted at all by whether we were friends or whether we hated each other. It didn't matter, just hit your number. And so that's kind of how I operated. Well, that was a breakdown in clarity, but I also had gotten no feedback from my boss about this being an issue until the performance appraisal. And so once I understood it was an expectation, and I understood I was falling short of this expectation, I fixed it. Like, it didn't take long to fix. I just made a tweak. Now I knew it was important. I knew it was expected, so I could change it. That's an example of how clarity and feedback can break down very easily. And like I said, in my experience, when you take clarity and then you add a lack of feedback on top of clarity, that accounts for probably 95% of the performance issues that I have seen throughout my career boil down to one of those two things. The individual just wasn't clear about what's expected, or if they were, they weren't getting any or getting the right feedback that they needed to understand that they were falling short of that expectation. Fix those two things, almost like immediately, often performance will change. So those are two really important. The third cause of underperformance is I don't know how. So I might be clear on expectations. I might have the feedback to know that I'm falling short, but I might just not be able to do the thing you're asking me to do. This happens sometimes if maybe we hire someone who we think has skills that they don't actually have. Maybe we didn't do a great job of interviewing. Maybe they oversold their skills in the interview. Sometimes we change things up in how work gets done. We put in a new system. You're right. There's all kinds of reasons things can happen. But someone just doesn't have the know-how or the skills to do the thing that you're asking them to do. And so this is really, when you encounter this, is roll up your sleeves and get in there and observe their work, right? See what's going on to see if you can identify if there's a know-how issue. And if there is, then you fix that with training or coaching or whatever is necessary. The fourth cause of underperformance then, if you have eliminated the other three as the cause, right? They're clear, they're getting the feedback, they have the know-how to do the job successfully. If they're still not performing, it might be that they just aren't able to do it, right? They for whatever reason, they lack the capability to do what's being asked. Now that can happen sometimes if maybe we promote someone that we shouldn't have. They get promoted kind of beyond their capability. Sometimes, this happens frequently where we take a really technically proficient employee who's great as an individual contributor in their role. We promote them into management, and then they really struggle as a manager. And you can give that person and this is a person that maybe they don't really want to manage people, or maybe they lack the sort of empathy or communication capabilities to really be effective as a people manager. And so all the training in the world, all the feedback in the world, all the clarity in the world probably isn't going to fix that. They might just never going to be a people manager because that's just not in the cards for them. Or it could be someone that maybe has something going on outside of work. Maybe they have some issues. Maybe they have some well-being challenges. They're have caregiving responsibilities that is so much of a burden they just don't have the mental capability to give to the job. Or maybe it could be a substance abuse problem. Whatever. There could be all sorts of issues that make them incapable of doing the job. And so if that's the issue, obviously you have to figure out what to do there. Sometimes it's getting them, if it's a well-being issue, getting them support. If it's a sort of true capability issue, and that I'm never, you can't build a capability. Some capabilities just can't be built into someone. If it's the wrong person in the wrong spot, then you got to help them get someplace where they can be successful. So that's number 4. And then the 5th issue is just that the person doesn't want to, right? This is a lack of desire, and this is where the lack of motivation comes in. And I will tell you, this does occasionally happen. You do have this occasionally show up, but I have found it to be exceptionally rare to find a situation where it's truly the person doesn't want to, or they have an unwillingness or a lack of motivation to do the job. Usually what we think is a lack of motivation tends to be a frustration that they're doing what they think they're expected to do, but there's a lack of clarity. They don't really understand. They're not really clear about what's expected. And so they're trying to do the thing they think they're expected to do, and then they're getting feedback that they're not living up to potential. So then they get frustrated. Of course they're frustrated. We'd all be frustrated in that situation. And then we interpret that as a lack of motivation or a lack of desire, when in actuality it's being caused by a lack of clarity. And so these are the 5 issues. When you run into a true lack of desire, which you don't often, because if you are addressing these in the order that I just laid out, which is how I would recommend you use them, right? address the most common issue first, clarity, lack of clarity about expectations. Make sure they're clear on expectations, and then make sure they're getting feedback, and then make sure they have the know-how, and then make sure that they have the capability. If you're addressing those things in that order, which is what makes sense to do, right? Start with the most common or most likely cause. Generally, the people that are truly not motivated to do the job, they don't want to do the job, they will quit. They will leave, because when you start actually paying attention and putting real clarity and accountability around the role, they generally will opt out, because it's no fun to not do your job if someone's actually trying to help you do your job successfully. Or it will resolve the issue, right? They will get back on board and they will get fired up because now they actually understand what's expected and they know how to be successful. And so now it makes more sense to re-engage. Those are what I call those are, I guess, the 5 causes of underperformance, but what they reveal are these 5 kind of needs, these 5 drivers of performance: clarity, feedback, know-how, capability, and desire. And technically it's really only 4, because my belief is that people are inherently and intrinsically motivated. They want to do a good job. And if you give them the other 4, if they're clear and they have feedback and they have the know-how and they have the capability, they're in the right role and they know what's expected and how to do it and how they're doing, they will perform, right? The desire is a thing that you rarely have to worry about. They have that inherently. So just create the conditions for them to be successful, and often they will. So 5 drivers of performance, that is what actually produces performance at work. And so if we go back and think about the story I started with this CEO, what I would and what I did advise him to do is to make sure that there's actual clarity about what's being expected of this group, where it's getting stuck. Because I'd bet a whole bunch that what's actually happening is that they aren't really clear about what's being asked of them. Right? There's some kind of the clarity's breaking down probably as it's cascading to them, and it's stuck. And so they're doing the best they can with what they think is expected. But if they were clear, they would probably be executing in the way that the leaders want them to. How do you do that? Well, I have a tool that I teach in my management and leadership programs that I call the clarity check-in process. And I love this tool because basically the advice that I always offer to anyone, any leader that's facing a performance or behavioral issue, is start with clarity. It's almost always clarity. Start with clarity. And this is the tool that helps you figure out, do we have a clarity breakdown? And if we do, how do you fix it? And so the clarity check-in is a tool and a process that, like I said, is really straightforward. It's simple to use. I'm going to walk you through it here, but I'm also going to put a link in the notes where you can download the full guide for this process and a link to a template that you can use. So you can go find that if you would like to learn more about it and put it to use. But here is how it works in short, is that this is a conversation that you have with an individual. So you have this individual that is struggling, right? Is not performing the way you expect. Maybe they're underperforming. Maybe they should be, you think they could be performing at a higher level. You're just not sure what's going on. You use this process to diagnose if you have clarity or not. And so you invite them into a conversation. You want to schedule the conversation a few days out, and then you ask this person in advance of the conversation to answer a couple of questions. And basically it boils down to asking them to write down what they believe the top 3 expectations are of success in their role or on this project, whatever the context is for your conversation. So you're going to ask them, what are the expectations, top 3 expectations? You're going to ask them what success looks like. You're going to ask them to define some things like that. So you want to really ask them to commit to writing. They're going to write this down. What is expected? What does success look like? You get that written down. Ask them to write that down, and then you do the same, right? So you write down what you see as the top 3 expectations for their role or for that project, what success looks like, that kind of thing, how their success is measured. So then when you have the meeting, you both arrive with your, what you have written down to those questions, and then you compare. And you compare to see how their answers and your answers align. And what you will find, and brace yourself for this, even if you have someone that you think is pretty clear, even when they are pretty clear, often there are some disconnects, right? Clarity is hard work. It's hard work to create it. It's hard work to maintain it. So this tool helps you kind of build the skills to do that. But you compare notes, and where you have, misalignment, where they have things on their list that aren't on your list and vice versa. As a leader, you basically just get curious. You ask them questions about, so tell me about where are you getting the message that is your primary, that's one of your expectations? Talk to me about that, because I have some things that are different on my list, and you kind of talk your way through the list. And then where you have a lack of alignment between the two, you, at the end of your conversation, basically say, okay, let's agree to what the top three are. And you lock down sort of answers to those questions that you both are agreeing on, that you're both now clear on, and then you have some documentation of that. That's something you want to ask the employee then to write down at the end of the meeting, so that you both have sort of crystal clarity about what they now understand is their expectation. So it's a very simple process, but I can tell you that it is incredibly powerful and incredibly effective. So that's the clarity check-in process. Always start with clarity, because clarity is very, very frequently going to be what the core cause is. And as a leader and manager, that falls on you. It is on you to create that clarity for them and with them. So that's awesome, because you can fix that. So I hope that was clarifying for you. I hope that's really helpful. 5 drivers of performance. You can use that to both diagnose when performance goes wrong, but you can also use it to make sure that employees have what they need, make sure they have clarity about what's expected, make sure that you're giving them feedback regularly, make sure they have the know-how to do their job effectively, make sure that you're putting the right people in the right roles that have the capability to do the job, and desire and motivation will take care of itself. So that's the 5 drivers. That's how employee performance works. Thank you for joining me and listening today. I hope you will take something back, download the clarity check-in process, take it back to your team, to your organization, to help both your people and your organization thrive. Until next time.